Just quickly introduce myself. My name is Russ Rosa. I'm a co-founder for QMax Technologies, the Senior Vice President for Innovation and Organizational Performance. I'm also the design team leader for the technology that we use. I am married to my college sweetheart and the father of 5 boys from ages 5 to 20. And very, very happy to be here. My business partner, Blake, if you'd introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Blake Edmonds. I am not married, but a father of 2 boys. I live in Philadelphia, and I'm really excited to be here. I didn't want to take a lot of time to talk about myself, because we have a lot to cover today, and I really want to give you guys a chance to, get to jump in and speak about, conscious business.
Indeed. So, just to kind of give you a framework of how this conversation is set up today, we're here kind of contrary to what the culture that we're showing up in operates. What I mean by that is that we live in an answer-driven society. If you happen to have the answer for something, you're recognized as the leader, you're recognized as the person, people will align around you so long as you have the answer. And, we have a whole culture that's organized itself around answers. The problem with answers that people in business often fall prey to is that you may have answers based on, all of your intelligence and all of your understanding, which may be applicable given the circumstances that you're facing, like that noise. But there's a point in time when the circumstances do change, that your answers are no longer applicable, and you're not nearly as effective as you once were. But based on what you know and how you know certain things, it limits and constrains your ability to be effective. So the nature of today's conversation is for us to be able to take our attention off of the answer and actually shift and bring our attention to the question and actually the inquiry that we're looking to create today. Because I say, the more powerful the inquiry, the more powerful and greater potential there is for multiple answers. And if as an executive, you have multiple answers from which you can move, you're never going to be in the situation where you're just simply stuck. So today's conversation is simply about looking to create multiple dimensions for you as an executive to grow your business. And that's really our focus today. And I want to just preface that by saying you are relieved of the burden of needing to agree with us. You are relieved of the burden of needing to necessarily understand what we say. The opportunity for you in today's conversation is to use this conversation and see, are you willing to stretch, and can you be big enough to include us? Because I promise, when you do the work and you actually give yourself permission to consider something that you may not have had a relationship to before, standing on the shoulders of our conversation, look at your circumstances. Not how you've known them, not how they've been familiar, but from this perspective. Because if we can move you 1 degree beyond what you know, what seems reasonable or rational to you, that 1 degree shift may be sufficient to open up a whole new dimension of effectiveness for you in your business. Also, I just want to say that how we're set up for today is, we're not teachers, this is not a class that we're leading, this is a discussion. We invite you to participate. Paula, who just was kind enough to introduce us, will walk around with the mic if you just simply raise your hand. Okay? Great. So, with that said, Blake, let's begin the inquiry.
Okay, so if we take a look at conscious business, we're looking at a model that's not new, right? It's been around. I guess I should scoot a little more. It's been around, and the question is, what is it about conscious business that makes it that we even have to focus on that? Why is that not the standard? Why is that not where business shows up across the board? And as someone who's starting a conscious business, this has to be something, a question you ask yourself. Because you show up in particular space, in particular waters, right? You show up in a particular environment that looks and recognizes you in a particular way. And so we wanted to take some time today, hopefully, to start to distinguish some things about that, to point out some things about the environment in which a conscious business shows up, such that you can design your business and how you speak about your business in such a way that it actually draws people to it, sets it apart, and indeed creates an alignment among the community of people who are looking to build and create conscious businesses. So if we were to take a look at another analogy, and we were to take a look at, let's say, Henry Ford. When he started building automobiles, that wasn't new. He didn't build the first automobile, he didn't create the first automobile. If we really take a look at what he did, what he actually did was he created a standard screw. He created 6 screws and said, we're going to build a car, we're going to make these 6 screws. It's all going to be built out of these 6 screws so that everyone's the same. Now, that seems a pretty simple thing. And people have been making screws for hundreds of years before that. But every time somebody made a screw, they made their screw. And then they built something with their screw. And then if that screw fell out, you were screwed. Because you now have to go get somebody to make an exact screw to replace that screw, which could take weeks. There was no standardization. By standardizing the screw, what became available was his ability to build the assembly line. Now, he also didn't invent the assembly line, right? People had assembly lines, they lined people up, they produced things and did stuff. But he had this breakthrough in this one area called, let's make a standard screw. And that standard screw made something available in terms of the production of automobiles that was never previously available. And that standard screw revolutionized manufacturing across the United States and ultimately the world. Seems pretty simple. When we take a look at conscious businesses, they're businesses that are designed to impact the quality of life for all people. Why wouldn't everybody get behind that? In fact, why would anybody have a business that wasn't a conscious business? It seems pretty simple. It's just not the world we live in. So how do we impact that world? What does it take? What's missing? Which is, if you want to know what we do, what we really do is we help to identify the what's missing, the presence of which makes a difference.
Now, I just want to speak to that for a second, because what's missing doesn't show up like an answer that you should have had, right? What's missing is something, it's the fundamental of it being missing is that there's no relationship to it. It's missing that it's missing. We have nothing to say about this. And it actually speaks to the condition that people who are creating a conscious business has to overcome. You know, there's a philosopher that we reference in our work. His name is Martin Heidegger. And Heidegger, in his work On the Way to Language, actually distinguishes the condition that businesses need to overcome. And he calls that condition the tranquilized obviousness. You know, that when we relate to the circumstances that we have, you know, we deal with these conditions as they occur, and we accept them because, you know, that's what's showing up in our experience. Now, it's difficult to talk about the tranquilized obviousness because we're tranquilized to it, and it's so obvious we don't see it. So we have to be able to start to notice other ways, other dimensions and relationships to this condition. So you might notice in your own experience, you might hear someone say, well, it is what it is. You know, when someone lays that on you, you know, that conversation is someone who's really given up on the circumstances that they have. They've forfeited creating something new because of the suchness of the circumstances. And if I were to play with the language a little bit, the isness of the circumstances. You know, another demonstration of this tranquilized obviousness as a condition shows up when you hear people say, well, everybody knows, and then fill in the blank. You know, there was a point in time when everybody knew the earth was flat. You know, and that kind of shaped and informed, knowing that the earth was flat would shape and inform how we would interact and what options we would use, what technology we might develop. Because it is what it is, right? Or we've always done it this way. You know, if you're out to create a conscious business, you're out to interrupt this level of unconsciousness, this suchness of things. And it takes something as a leader, someone who's got a commitment to making a difference, as people who are leading in this movement of conscious business, to be able to do, I'm going to use the word violence, but I don't mean violence in the way that we ordinarily speak of violence. I'm speaking of violence in the kind of violence that Gandhi was. I'm speaking to the kind of violence that Martin Luther King was, you know, or Nelson Mandela was. You know, people who saw the suchness of the circumstances and wanted and were a demand for more, to raise that level of awareness and to make something else available. So again, just building on what Blake's saying, in this conversation, in this context of there being something missing, you know, the job of a leader in a conscious business is to be able to effectively distinguish what that vision, value, or opportunity may be, and design the language to create the experience of that opportunity for the audience that you're targeting. Because once you connect with that, once people have an experience of that value, an experience of that opportunity for themselves, they'll act accordingly and in alignment with what it is you're out to create.
So now to impact this tranquilized obviousness, how do we pierce that? How do we break that? How do we create an opportunity for something else to show up for someone else's experience? And I'm going to assert the answer is language. And so Paula kind of indicated we created new language. We create new language. We look to see, again, the what's missing, the presence of which will make a difference. I'm going to assert that if you take a look at anything you're committed to, or actually, let's just look at it from a societal standpoint. If you look at society, if you want to know what a society values, look at their language. Look at what they have words for. So here's a great example I can give you. If you take a look at the Maasai tribe in Africa, they raise cattle. That's how they that's how they live. They survive off of the cattle. And here's what's interesting, all the cattle are brown. They've got a bunch of brown cattle. But for the Maasai, they have 35 different words for brown. I got one, brown. Okay, we made it feel beige. Okay, cream. I can come up with a couple, especially if I'm like in like Lowe's and there's the menu. But they have 35 words for brown. Like, there's a brown cow, I just see a brown cow. But they can look at the brown cow and go, that cow's pregnant. Because they know what a pregnant brown cow looks like. And that cow's sick. And that cow's dehydrated. And that cow has whatever it has going on. And they know this just by the color of the cow. And they have language for that because it matters. It's important. Their survival is dependent upon it. You're here because you have a business idea, you have a business, you're working on doing something that's sustainable in the world. And we have a world that's on fire. We do. And the question is, how do we impact that? And what we say is we do that by creating language that pierces the tranquilized obviousness about how we do it now. And you want to start to look, what is the language that exists for me in speaking about a conscious business such that people can recognize the choice of my business and supporting that, or the choice of supporting any conscious business over another business that's kind of contributing to the fire?
You know, it's really interesting because when we have this conversation and we start to point to there's a need for language here, invariably, you know, there's people who kind of drift into the thought, this is just semantics. This is just a game, right? You're just talking about something. Well, I really invite you to consider and to actually look for yourself. Do you have a relationship with anything for which you don't have language? I mean, really look. If you don't have any language for it, what relationship could you possibly have?
It literally doesn't exist for you. In the absence of being able to speak about it, it literally doesn't exist. Helen Keller, in her autobiography, spoke about what it was to make that connection and get the first word. When she got her first word, water, and she was able to actually connect that to the feeling of water, what she had to say was the world became available for her. That before that moment, she lived in darkness that was void. And in that moment, emotions, love, hate, everything became available in that moment. There's an autobiography written about Christopher Columbus, and speaks about when he comes to the shore for the first time and meets the Native Americans. And they point back and they say, the Native Americans say, where'd you come from? And they point back and say, clipper ships. But they had no concept of clipper ship. And they write about how it took a week until they could explain to the shaman what a clipper ship was. And once he understood what a clipper ship was, he explained it to the tribe, and then they all saw the clipper ships. Before that, they simply showed up like ghosts in these little boats. If it doesn't exist for language, it doesn't exist for human beings.
And that's a great opportunity to pause and look for yourself. You know, are you innovating and creating at the level of language for your business? Or are you struggling to have your business emerge and manifest because the language that's there is contrary? The momentum that exists pushes against what you're out to invent and the difference you're looking to make. So this is a real opportunity, and it really takes some work. The heavy lifting is distinguishing the language that allows something to manifest. And the manifestation is it shows up in the experience of your audience, right? You measure it as a function of people's self-interest. If they have an experience of the vision, of the value, of the opportunity that you're speaking of in your business for themselves, they align very, very quickly, and they carry that message forward. You know, there's, just to give you a for instance, there was a point in time when there was no such thing as human rights. You know, if we look back 1,000 years ago, maybe the king would have rights, maybe a priest would have rights, maybe a landowner would have rights. But if it was just us, and we weren't part of any of those three groups, there'd be no such thing. But it wasn't until people started to distinguish this conversation about human rights. You know, maybe it's something along the lines where I could have been the guy that had a particularly hard day in the field and just turned to you and said, hey, listen, I don't know about you, but I've about had it with this working from dawn to dusk. You know, I'm a human being. I don't understand how the ox or how the horse is more valuable than us. Maybe what's missing is this thing I've been thinking about, and I'm going to call it human rights. And as I have a conversation about human rights with someone who's never heard of this thing before, I'm not trying to convince you, I'm not trying to manipulate you, I'm simply speaking of the difference that this makes in the quality of my experience. And as someone who's listening to that conversation, you get to identify with the vision and the value and the opportunity of human rights. Now that changes something fundamentally for you. because you now become someone who now notices that human rights doesn't exist. And you're related to how you see it being something that makes a difference in your own experience. People who then interact with you, hey, what's going on? You look different today. What happened? It's like, well, let me tell you, I heard about this thing called human rights. And you now have a conversation talking about the vision, value, and the opportunity. People who hear that conversation attach to it their experience of that vision, their experience of that value, their experience of that opportunity, and they go forth now into the world where they get noticed because something's different. And it creates now this viral DNA such that now people see the greatest possibility of that conversation. You don't have to be, if we were only talking about human rights for farmers, or human rights for the blacksmith, or anybody that had the baker or the candlestick maker, right? Any of those folks in our society, well, I'm not one of those. So what do I care about human rights? Your job in creating the language of a conscious business and distinguishing the vision, value, and opportunity that business is in the world is to be able to create the biggest possible conversation for a vision, a value, and an opportunity, such that people can see themselves and measure against what you're creating the quality of their own experience. So that's what we're speaking about when we're really looking at the work that this language makes available, because it's absolutely fundamental. It doesn't exist if there's no language.
And so how do we get to that language, right? How do we get it started? How do we get it in the world? How do we maintain it? Alignment. I don't know how many of you have seen Finding Nemo, but I love Finding Nemo. Have kids, what can I say? But in Finding Nemo, there's this scene where all the fish are stuck in the net. And Nemo says, I know what to do. Everybody's got to go the same direction. And they go the same direction, they push the net to the bottom, and all the fish get out. We're all in the same net. The world's on fire. Right? You're here because you have a commitment to a conscious business, and you see the impact that conscious business makes on the world. That you can have a business that takes care of its employees, that takes care of its environment, that takes care of its local community, and also impacts its global community as an extension. It's available. But what is required is an aligned conversation. Part of the reason we're here is we love this environment, and it's an environment where the conversations can be aligned. The question is, what are the conversations? What is there to distinguish? What can you notice about what's missing that, if it were present, would impact the quality of your business, the quality of the marketplace in which your business shows up? Your business is designed to support its environment. What are the conversations in the environment that support your business? So I'm just inviting you now to kind of take a look for yourself, just to kind of take a moment and to look at, as you set up your business, as you're setting up your business, as you're looking at your business idea, what is it about the contribution that you make that's valuable? And how is that represented in how both that you speak about your business, how your business shows up, and also the conversation you're creating for other people to have about your business? So is there anybody who can start to point to anything that they've seen, just in the realm of this entire conversation? Is there anything that you've noticed about this? Anything that's shown up for you?
If you'd raise your hand, Paul is coming with the mic. Over there, Paul, gentlemen.
Whose hand was? Whose hand?
One thing I was noticing is that in the conscious business I was looking to create around bringing mindfulness and various other somatic and other practices to businesses through corporate training. The language I was using was here's the ROI that you can have on this, or here's how your employees won't have back pain. These already the patterns within that world that are so default, instead of creating new language to distinguish what is possible.
So you're pointing to something really great. So what's great is, and that talks to the environment that things show up in. There is already a language for business, right? We're not showing up in something new, right? But again, Henry Ford didn't make the first automobile, right? He didn't make the first screw. He didn't line up the first people to say, put these things together one piece at a time. None of that was original. What he did was he said, I'm gonna make this standard so that everything else works easy. There's something about this conversation we've missed so far. I don't have the answer to it, I just know it's there. And I know it's there because this conversation's too important and it makes too big of a difference. So, yes, I don't know what the answer to that is, but if you don't know the water that you're in, you couldn't possibly distinguish anything else either, right? And that's the difficulty, right? They say, 3 things are unknown. Air to the bird, water to the fish, man to himself. So thanks for taking a look. Anybody else?
I think it's really interesting, this point that you're bringing up, because as I've been trying to develop that conversation and how to have it, especially when you have only a few minutes maybe to initially discuss it, that elevator pitch, I realized when I was first cultivating the ideas and trying to understand them myself that I didn't know how to say it without talking for 20 minutes. And I've noticed that as I keep getting more clarity in what it is, so that it fits into conversations that people already understand, like words people already understand, but then kind of making the analogies or whatever it is so that I can relay it better. It's like each time I get more clarity in my language, the better my business grows.
Yes.
And it's like such an obvious point
Connection.
that it has happened simply because I know how to talk about it now, and then people can experience it without me having to go through my entire process. And then at the end, they're like, oh, that's what this whole thing was? Like they didn't even know what they were really signing up for until the end. And
Yes.
it's weird, but it's really true. It's like the language that's made the difference.
Listen, the world shows up for human beings in language. We live in a world defined by the language that we use. If you want to know what someone's world looks like, just listen to them. They'll tell you. It shows up in their language. It's just mostly, we're not trained to listen for that. That's what we do. We go into businesses and we listen for the language. We listen for the what's there, the what's missing, and we map that against the company's mission, the company's goals, the company's objectives. And then we bring and distinguish the what's missing, the presence of which makes a difference.
Yeah, it's actually interesting too, because I'd invite you to consider it's a muscle that you're building, right? And it really takes building this muscle over time. I would relate it to, the idea of when you hear a brand new song and it just has something about the song that captures you. You may enjoy it, you may recognize it as you hear it, around your environment every once in a while, and you start playing that music over and over again. But notice, you don't have the words down, right? It's just not there for you. And yet, as your relationship to this music evolves, what evolves and what grows is your relationship to the lyrics until you can completely generate the song on your own, right? And you can play with and enjoy. It's the same when we're talking about our conscious business. I promise you may be really, really excited about your business. And it's like hearing a new song for the first time. Until you develop and distinguish the language that lyric is, the lyric of your business, you'll be struggling, right? Because it really is hard. And it's a challenge, but the opportunity is to constantly look and have conversations. Your business doesn't exist. Actually, there is more, let me put it more succinctly, there is more of your business if you're just starting out that shows up in the domain of what currently isn't than in the domain of how it is. So it's easy for people to lose relationship to that value, that vision, that opportunity. And once you stop speaking, your business stops as well. Your job as a leader, someone who's out to make a difference and raise the level of consciousness that your business is to constantly be in this conversation, practicing and building this muscle, distinguishing this vision, value, and opportunity of your business, the possibility of your business, and again, relating it to the self-interest of your audience.
Your buddy. We got it. You're right.
Thank you. Just wanted to share that the experience with language, I see this repeatedly in my practice. I blend metaphysics and career development, and one of the initial assessment phases is helping the client find their talent or knowing what their gifts are. And it's repeated. They tend not to have a language for what they're good at. And they can give an entire list of what they're not good at.
Yeah, they figured that out real quick.
But when it comes to what they're actually passionate about, what they're good at, what they love to do, they can actually demonstrate it, but when it comes to verbalizing and actually declaring, I am good at, right? Or I specialize in, I am powerful in, this language is vacant. So just sharing, I've experienced that very often.
Excellent. Listen, and half of the battle is recognizing it. Because mostly we walk around tranquilized to it. And if you're tranquilized to it, it doesn't show up for you and you have no power around it. So the first step is to notice it. And then once you notice it, then you can start to look for what are the levers, like kind of what you're working with, right? What's the language that gives me some facility with this? What moves this thing? What has my clients recognize their talents and actually gets them in action and creating more language around that for themselves? I promise you, if you work on giving your clients language around what it is they're talented about, their talents in that area will develop faster than anything you've seen before in your business. Their skills in that area will raise more rapidly. We are driven by language, and yet we're never taught how to use it.
Actually, I'll give him a second. Is this on, Kelly? There we go. Thank you. You know, just building on what Blake just said, as your clients develop their facility and their language around their skill set, it's that language that gets carried out beyond the scope and the frame of their influence, right? Because then that gets put out into the world. It now exists, and people will now come to know you in this new way when what they know is the language of your opportunity and the language of your skill set. And I say that in order to draw the parallel to human rights. Human rights was something that there was no silver bullet conversation that in and of itself caused human rights to exist in the world. Not one individual came up and said, hey, you know what, human rights, Shazam, human rights, right? Now everybody knows, right? It wasn't like that, right? And the vision, value, and opportunity of human rights, it had to be distinguished and languaged into existence over and over and over again, so that people who hear it for the first time, you know, their awareness of what's possible grows. And when you're looking at the business that you're in, are you languaging it into existence for other people? Are you speaking in such a way that people are relating to that opportunity and can identify to that possibility for themselves? Because that's how your business will be known. That's the whole nature of a viral conversation. It isn't viral just because it's fun. It's viral because it makes a difference in the quality of the experience of the listener. And it's often overlooked. You know, right now, if we talk about a conventional conversation for traditional business, we would talk about financing, we would talk about accounting, we would talk about HR issues, where's the facility going to be, let's get our social media plan in place, you know, all these things that are just in place because these are the cogs in the wheel that we need to have. But no one's really looking and designing the language of the opportunity of your organization. And that's why I say it doesn't exist to the fullness and richness that's available. Building that muscle, distinguishing that language, creating that opportunity in the experience of your audience, and doing that over and over again. You can't have the launch party for the business and say, that's great, you know, what's next is to cash the checks. Because if human rights required being distinguished and languaged into existence hundreds, thousands, millions of times, then in fact, look at how you're speaking of your business. Are you constantly forwarding that language? Paula, there's a gentleman over there.
Hi, my name is and I'm a designer and a tailor, and I've been thinking a lot about language because I'm trying to create a new word for upcycle. So my issue is I make recycled bow ties out of the finest new material that you can get from a suit, but the word upcycle is tied to this crafty, Etsy vision that I don't want to be tied with, because I want to figure out a system to manufacture the fabric out of the recycled material, but it happens to be the nicest material in the world. So I just, how do you feel about creating new words?
We do it all the time.
Yeah.
And not only do we do it all the time, we actually take words that everybody knows and says, yeah, no more of that. We're not going to make it mean X, right? Because we can do that so long as the audience that you're speaking to can have an experience of that new language connecting some opportunity for them.
Yeah, there has to be value, right? Just like I talked about with the Maasai, 35 different words for brown, but the value is there for them in their society, understanding those 35 different, not only being able to distinguish the color, but understanding the significance of them is the difference between life or death, right?
That's where I'm at with that. There's, you know, like super 150s suits. It's a type of suit that most people can't even explain why it's twice as much as every other suit, but it's in great detail. It goes down to the fact that the merino sheep are purebred from New Zealand, and only these Italian people within the last 10 years have created the nanotechnology to even weave these fibers that are like a millionth the size of human hair, but nobody can really explain that.
But it sounds
And
like
if they
you
do
can.
there is value there, but it's not being explained well at all.
Yeah, but the
It
question
just
is,
gets thrown away.
listen, you just explained it.
Sure.
But now the question is, how do you get that out there? And is there, basically a market? Are there people who, listen, understanding it certainly now brings an understanding of, oh, this is why it costs twice as much. Who knew? But just seeing a price tag makes no difference. And mostly that's the world we live in, right? So the question is what does it take to build that conversation about the fabric? What does it take to get that out there? Listen, I'm willing to bet most people didn't know the Messiah 35 words for brown. But I'm willing to bet most of you guys are never going to forget that, right? So what's it take to create that conversation, to put it out there in the world, and to tie it to something that's compelling? And if you tie that conversation to value, if you tie that conversation to, the upscale market, what are you going to tie it to? What is it going to be connected to that people value? In this case, brown is tied to survival. I can give you another example. The Inuit Eskimos, they have over 100 words for snow. I promise you probably couldn't give me 6, right? But if you're an Inuit Eskimo, you better know the kind of snow that is over the thin ice. Because if not, you're not going to be around long, right? So it matters there. And the question is can you make it matter? Can we make it matter? We have a commitment to a type of business that not only is successful for us as a business, but that impacts our community and makes a difference. Can we make it matter? What's the conversation to be created about that? What's the conversation that provides the extra value for saying, I'm gonna buy the Ford, because guess what, it only has 6 screws and they all match, right? Because again, he wasn't the only guy making cars. But the market saw the value of that. Wow, when it breaks, I can fix it. Easy, I don't have to wait 3 weeks for a screw. I can literally go down there, get one, I'm back in 10 minutes. That had value. There's a value to the story about the wool. There's a value to what that brings to the table. And the question is, can you distinguish that, have that show up in other people's experience, and have it live in the world, like human rights, right?
Thank you. We have another question over here.
Not for nothing, I now care about the wool very much.
Yeah, you want to know more, right?
Hi everyone, Nico. Nice to meet you all. I just wanted to say one of the things that I was forced to learn as a programmer is that there are a lot of technical challenges that can't really be solved unless you use or create a language, a programming language, in order to meet that challenge. So whether you're using JavaScript or Python or whatever language you're coding in, there are certain challenges that you simply can't solve without knowing that language. And oftentimes, the people that you're working with, whether they're in business development or they're investors, they don't speak that language at all. And that's not the best situation in terms of conscious business, because there are a lot of perverse incentives that are aligned there when people aren't speaking the same language in terms of deception and fraud. And one of the things that I found is that since I started my own company as opposed to working for larger companies, sometimes having a really small team can help to make sure that everyone is speaking the same language, because there are fewer issues in terms of compliance and everyone learning certain kind of vocabulary, because everyone has their specialty in a large organization. But these days you can accomplish a lot with a small team, and you can make sure that everyone's on the same page so that you have the time to also have a conversation about how can we do this ethically, because otherwise that's really difficult.
Couple of great points there, Nico, I want to circle back to. So, I love what you said. Here's the water you're in. So, the water, the tranquilized obviousness for you is, it's great when you have a small team. The challenge for you now is, how do I scale up my team and keep the same level of alignment, right? Because ultimately, the success of your business is dependent upon alignment for what you do, moving beyond you. His business is dependent upon alignment of people seeing the value of that wool over other types of woven wool. That's what the success is dependent upon. And how do you do that? I'll give you an answer to this one, but I'd like to hear some.
That's the only answer.
Yeah, but how do you do that? So, yeah, but what language? So yes, language. That's the answer, but what language?
One that everyone speaks.
Okay, say more.
I think sometimes you almost have to create
Mike, please.
I think sometimes you almost have to create that language in the same way that you might have to create a programming language if none of the current languages, meet the task. It happens all the time.
So you're 100% heading in the right direction, but you're not there yet. So who else can pick up the baton from Nico?
I mean, what's interesting is that was going to be like a point I made about lexicons and actually creating languages to build community around businesses.
Yes.
Like once you get into you as the internal language, and I work with marketing, so it's the external language, building community around, and it also gives people the opportunity to be a part of something.
Yes. Okay, hold on. And what is it about that language? What's the nature of the language that we're looking to create that builds this alignment? Because now Nico has this team. And he's got his team, it's 4, it's 6, it's what it is. And now Nico knows that the next step, man, when I get to 10, I'm screwed. So what's he do?
Is it about speaking to people and their values, like in their sense of values, like that they'll listen kind of thing?
Yes, and say more. So you're headed in the right direction, right? So you're moving in the right direction, so it's about values, right? Because he's created a set of values with this small group. And then when we scale up, those values get lost. The question is, why? And even better than why, how do we keep them? And again, how do we spread those values beyond our borders? Listen, I'm from Philadelphia. The neighborhood I live in, I literally live 2 blocks from the largest co-op in the entire country. This co-op was started in '73. And they just had a commitment to being able to provide fresh food, farm fresh food, and they have 6,200 families are a member of the co-op. They have 10,000 members. It's amazing. We have 26 local farms that food is sourced for, or from. It's phenomenal. And they support and give back. They work with high schools. It's a phenomenal opportunity. But again, 72. It took a long time to get that going. I've seen this thing develop. I've seen it struggle. I've seen it grow. I've seen it now become sustainable in a way that didn't exist 10 years ago.
You know, what's interesting about what Blake's speaking about there, when you talk about the sustainability of this co-op, which was a great idea in '72, right? And now so many years later, is looking at the opportunity of language. We don't normally ask what the opportunity of our language is, you know, because what is it? You know, I mean, other than maybe sounding smarter than somebody, which is pretty, you know, like low bar stuff, what is it about language and the power of language where there's an opportunity to generate something? Because if we really look at what's available when you have powerful language is alignment. And alignment creates critical mass. The more, obviously, the more people are aligned with an opportunity, the more people are aligned with the difference that's being made, it starts to aggregate. And you have more people adding to that conversation, and that language gets carried further and further out. I mean, listen, lettuce, organically grown lettuce back in 1972 is no different than organically grown lettuce in 2017. What shifted was the opportunity of the conversation, where people were able to relate to the vision, value, and opportunity powerfully in their own self-interest. You know, organically grown lettuce is great if you don't want pesticides exposure. If that's what you want, you know, that's wonderful stuff. And there were people, a couple of people in '72 who thought that's a good idea. But in '72, there wasn't any language for that, right? It was all about mass production. It was all about bringing efficiencies. You know, instead of the heirloom tomato that you can get today, you know, the industry of farming was focused on, let's get one really good tomato that we can pluck. You know, it'll go through whatever it goes through, but it'll be able to last and sustain until market. Who cares if we remove flavor? Who cares if we removed all these other things? It needs to be shelf stable, right?
And shiny.
Yeah, and look good, and red, right? As if red is the only tomato color out there, right? Nature had something to say about that. But it wasn't until people started to recognize, you know, a new conversation for value. Shelf-stable, ready tomatoes are not really exciting in 2017. You know, the fact that you can now get something that is organically grown, is fresh,
flavorful,
and yeah, and like unrecognizable flavor compared to what I know I grew up with. You know, it's a whole new paradigm shift. And it occurs because the language has shifted and alignment has been created. That alignment is what you're looking to create in your business. The vision, value, and the opportunity of what that looks like in the success of your organization?
Full disclosure, I'm a client of these guys. I love them so much that I came on my holiday against my mom's best wishes. So you mentioned, we're talking about languaging things into existence, and you've done an incredible job helping our company do that. Just real quick, I'm a serial entrepreneur, but this is the first time I think I run what I would call a conscious company. Integrity, which I think you're alluding to in your own life. The integrity of relationships at a company. How do you talk about that for a little bit? How do you talk about work with people and the language between each other and the integrity of and coming back to integrity, not just of the company as a whole, but how you work together. And the reason I bring it up is I come back to the foundational calls, particularly the integrity conversation, for conversations, for issues I'm having with clients, partners and employees.
Okay. We're going to get to that in a second. And the reason I say we'll get to that in a second is I can wrap up that answer much easier once we get to Nico's answer. Okay? So give me just a minute on that. Because I just want to give a few more people an opportunity to see what we came up with so far with Nico was, have this problem, have people all working great, how do I scale it up? And young lady, what's your name? What was that? Raquel. And Raquel said, great, language. There's something about the language. So we know that there's something about the language that provides something for scaling people up. And what I was asking was, great, what about the language? What language? Raquel has something else over here, Paula, Paula? Raquel has. So what about the language? And Raquel, maybe she's got it now, but I want to kind of say, I want you guys to kind of be in this, because this is the work, people. This is the what it takes, to kind of go through and to distinguish something.
It's about inspiration.
That's a piece of it.
Yeah, it's like
you got all the pieces of it, right? So you're right around it. But again, this is what's great about language, right? So you got all the pieces of it, and what we want to distinguish, but what is it about that?
Let us speak for a second.
Yeah. No, I mean, when you were talking about it more, I just envisioned a group of people, like 10 people, working for something hard, and if their leader, is talking to them in their values and in the company's values, but inspiring them long term, so they can see not only the success and the growth of the company, but also the better, the quality of their life through these years and this hard work and this respect to what the belief is. I feel that would make a difference.
Absolutely. And how do we language that?
Well, I guess also through motivation and making those goals that, if we're like this, then things are going to change for all of us at this point. I guess by giving examples, the language is putting things out there.
Okay, I'm going to lead you to the answer. You ready? So, back a few hundred years ago, there were these 26 guys who had this idea, and they thought, we should have a free and independent nation. But there's this other guy on the other side of the ocean, he's not going to go for that. Right? So what did they do? What was that? Where did that just pop up?
They made the Declaration of Independence.
They made a declaration, right? So I'm asserting that what's missing is a declaration, and one big enough for everyone to find themselves. Human rights was a declaration. It was one that was big enough for the butcher, the baker, and the candlestick maker. They all found themselves. If it was a small declaration that was just for the farmer, then, farmers maybe get rights they don't, and everybody else goes, yeah, why the hell do I care? What's in it for me, right? I think we're all kind of here because we all kind of have a sense of the world's on fire, right? And we want to be part of a conversation that allows us to have a business that also impacts that fire. What's missing for Nico is a big enough declaration that as he scales up, the rest of the people get on board. The rest of the people are like, not only do I see the declaration, this is the company I want to work for because of what they're up to. We've seen that. We've seen companies that we're like, that company's awesome. I love what they're up to. I'm gonna buy their products. I don't even need what they have. I'm just gonna buy it. Because they're up to such great stuff. We've all seen that. What is it to create that conversation? And it's literally just that, a created conversation. So everything you said, yes. And the language around it is the declaration.
Right, the declaration as a specific act in language, right? It speaks to something that doesn't exist today. And it speaks to a greater possibility and a greater sense of vision and opportunity, so that people are constantly moving towards that. And as you aggregate the amount of people that move in that particular direction, that condition of alignment starts to happen. And as more and more people become aligned, you gain critical mass. And as you gain critical mass, you see it becomes like a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? More alignment, more people show up, that they're there because they're aligned, and it starts to get this cyclical growth, right? And it can shift and transform instantly, because all of a sudden you've got people really connected to a powerful vision, value, or opportunity, and they're acting in accordance with the fulfillment of that declaration as a promise.
Now to circle back to your question, David, the answer to your question is simple. There's not a powerful enough relationship to the declaration for you to be able to reference that as the standard of whatever the goal is. So when things are off track, how do you know? See, if we're just going out and we don't have a goal in mind, then we're walking and wherever we end up is fine. But if we have a goal, then it's really quick to know, am I going in the right direction? Without a strong declaration to which you can reference the disagreements, to which you can reference the direction, bringing things back becomes very tricky. And not only that, then people can, quote, move the goalposts. Does that make sense? So now, inside of this conversation about a declaration, inside of this conversation about what it takes now to create an opportunity, literally the opportunity for people to participate in your organization, what is it that people see about that? Can you see something about where you are right now, and either something that might be missing or something that you can bring forward, moving forward to your current situation?
So for people who are thinking about what language they should use to communicate these ideas, like what's the next step that people can take? If someone's like, I have an idea, I'm struggling to figure out how to communicate it to the right people, to the right audience, in the right tone, what can someone do today to get to that point?
I mean, it's about distinguishing. So what you want to do is, it's about, again, it's literally about getting that language. I mean, the communication with Russ and myself. I'm not sure what to tell you on that exactly.
No, I got something here.
Okay.
Listen, the business that you're speaking about that doesn't exist today needs to be created, right? And it's not that you're changing something here. You're actually creating something. See, there's a difference when we look at what it is to change a particular thing. You know, if we really get down to the brass tacks, change is adding something to or taking something away from something. And we're relegated to the fundamentals of what we're trying to change, right? And you hear it in business all the time. Change initiative, change plan, change strategy. Listen, nonsense. That's not the conversation you're in. You're out to create something that currently isn't, in a world that only knows how it is. And creation is something from nothing. So when you're in this conversation looking to like, what's this next step? It literally is an act like jazz, right? Jazz gets invented in the moment, right? The musicians, the mood, the place, and you know, people are just kind of playing off of a particular vibe. There is a kind of jazz that you want to play with your language in order to start distinguishing this vision, value, and opportunity. because, you know, you're gonna try this out. Hey, what does this sound like? You know, a jazz musician just starts playing a tune, and then to see, you know, can other people collaborate and build off of that melody? Well, in much the same way, there's the language that is the tune that you're starting out with. And, you know, in the beginning, it may be very choppy, it may be very difficult. You know, it doesn't really exist yet. It has to be created. It has to be distinguished. And the act of distinguishing something is an act that broadens the horizon of opportunity, broadens the horizon for people to be included. So right now, what it looks like when you're really starting a business and this conscious business venture that you're in is looking to see, hey, what can I say about this? And how can I say it in different ways? And who can I test this language on to see what people see and you know, can they resonate with the vision, value, and opportunity? Because that's where it begins, right?
As a writer, it's nice for me to hear you both give so much power to words and language. I think that's so what I'm hearing is that writing is key here to communicate this, and writing is key.
Indeed it is.
Which writing, as we know, is about staring out into space a lot of time, but like blocking off the time.
Sure.
So would it be fair to say the first step could be reserve an hour?
Well, create a structure to be able to deliver on that, right? If there's something that you need to do, you need structure to be able to support you through the process. So, you know, if there's a practice that you set yourself up for, much like the musician, right? You know, who becomes masterful in their instrument through the practice that they've had, such that they have the freedom to play. They're not necessarily relegated to certain notes or certain melodies. So this conversation is constantly, as an evolution, as an emerging event, it's just constantly doing that kind of work. A structure that gives you the opportunity to distinguish the language and then to go out and test that language in the world.
Hi there, my name is Lillian. Really appreciate your point of view and align with it quite deeply. One of the things that really helps me engage the creative process around my business are questions.
Sure.
And I'm wondering if perhaps you could share with us, with me and the rest of us, maybe a question or two that could allow for a meditative experience that could maybe lead us toward language, new language, and that refinement, essentially. So if we were working together, you know, what would be some of those questions that you would have me ponder?
I know where I would begin is looking at the difference, you know, asking about the difference that you want to make, right? What's the condition today? You know, what's it like now, right? Because you're coming into this idea of a business and you're looking to make a difference, right? So we would begin by identifying this ground rule of, well, where are we, right? Henry Kissinger has a great quote when he says, the job of a leader is to get a group of people from where they are to where they've never been. So you have to begin, your strategies begin and align most powerfully when they're related to where you are now, and then being able to be in the conversation, looking at the difference, looking at the value, looking at the opportunity that you're out to generate. If this is what it's like now, what's the future possibility that you're speaking of, and what would the fulfillment of that promise look like? And it doesn't exist today, right? So at first it may seem abstract and esoteric in nature, but it is abstract and esoteric in nature. It doesn't exist. So we're looking to elicit some new perspective and some new opportunity. But that's where I would begin, really getting grounded in the what's so today, and then being able to ask then, and now that that's the condition, what's the possibility for the future that you're looking to make? Thank you, Lily.
hearing you guys say is kind of around a sense of time and timing as well. From having certain experiences, it ends up creating a situation that then provokes a new language to come from it. So is part of that timing aspect, like you gave the example of 9/11, it was like after that, having that experience, then people had a value and a reason to build a language. What if you end up feeling like for people, like, I don't know, waiting for the circumstances and the environment to explain the need for the business or the timing of language to come with that?
I kind of get the direction you're going here. Let me. There is the nature of what it is to cause a breakthrough, right? And so we say who we are is that we're people who work with people to cause breakthroughs in their performance. The nature of a breakthrough, however, is that it's a result that couldn't have been predicted. So now what we're coming in to deliver is a result that we can't predict, right? Because anything we could say, oh, this is what we're going to deliver, that can't be it, because that ain't a breakthrough. It's beyond what could have been imagined. That's the nature of a breakthrough. The question is, how do you accomplish that? How do you take that on? What does it take to distinguish a breakthrough, to distinguish this result that the minute I call it, that ain't it, right? Kind of complicated. And again, it all shows up in language. And so the other thing I'll say about language is this. The realm in which this language shows up for us is the realm of distinction. So multiple times during this conversation, what I've referenced is something that was distinguished. The Maasai with the brown, the Eskimos with the snow, right? A distinction is something that itself does not exist, but it makes something else available. Color is a distinction. If you're colorblind, everything just shows up in shades of gray for you, right? But if you have access to color, if you can distinguish color, how many colors are then available? An infinite number. And that's the nature of a distinction, is it brings an infinite number of possibilities. The specific area that we work in business, that we're working with people, is leadership. I can tell you for most people, just like I said, hey, how many words do you have for snow? They can probably give me 6 different ways leadership shows up for them. Getting beyond 6 is really tough for most people. Because they can say, oh, here are the characteristics of a leader. They have followers, they're, in charge, whatever they have to say about it. But I'd really say if you pull out a piece of paper to make yourself a list, by the time you hit 6, you're like, hey, what else?
You gotta get real creative.
Right, you start getting real creative. But again, leadership is a distinction, just like color is a distinction. There are an infinite number of ways to distinguish leadership, just not for most people. What we bring is the distinction in those areas where distinction is lacking. So the difficulty in your question is this. The context from which your question comes is insufficient to contain the answer I would give you. You got it? So it's kind of like you have this fishbowl and you're going, yeah, but I'm trying to understand this. So I'm going, great, and here's my swimming pool full of answer. But it's not going to fit in what you have. So I get your question. I can't really get to it here other than to say we bring distinction in areas that lack distinction. And once that happens, a whole world opens up that was previously unavailable.
Yeah, I actually want to build on something here because I think more specific to your point when you were asking the question, listen, I really want to create this business, but society doesn't recognize it yet, or I'm really wishing for, making a go at this venture. I'm hoping for this opportunity. And there's a big, big trap. We have a culture that says, hey, you gotta want it bad enough. If you really, really want it, you gotta do that. Or you gotta wish for it, or you gotta hope for it, right? And there's a bankruptcy to that model. One of the projects I worked on several years ago, and it actually came out of the experience of 9/11, was I just felt so assaulted by the nature of the violence that day was. And if you actually stop to look at what the nature of violence is, there is a conversation where violence is the language of the unheard. People who feel that they're not being listened to become violent, right? To make their point, to emphasize what it is they're trying to say. And I wasn't anybody at the time in 01 when that day happened who had any, there's clearly an enormous amount of violence in the world, right? Look at what today was. And I remember, and working with several people who were just as upset by the experience. We were looking to see where could we identify communities with violence. And what we did was we created the Breakthrough Impact Project. Breakthrough Impact Project was a project that was designed to go into prison and recognize that the inmates who are in prison, one way to look at it is like, oh, they're bad, they're wrong. But another way to look at it is maybe the people are incarcerated and they're in jail today because it is the fulfillment of the promise of the leadership that they were exposed to in their community.
Say that again. Say that again.
Okay. So just to emphasize the point, the people who were in jail, it wasn't that they were necessarily these bad guys, they were just fulfilling the promise of the leadership style of their community. And if you're doing things that go contrary to what society has, the way that turns out is you go into jail, right? Now, we worked with a full range and spectrum of inmates. It didn't matter what their particular infraction was. So there were murderers in the group, drug dealers in the group, some child molesters in there, some rapists. I mean, really hardcore guys. And there wasn't a single one of them who didn't want to get out of jail. There wasn't a single one who would lay their head into their cot at night and hope that tomorrow they'd be free. They really, really wanted it. And it makes no difference. See, wishing, wanting, and hoping to get out of jail, just like wishing, wanting, and hoping to have a successful business, actually makes a net zero impact in the world, except in one domain. If you consider, if you're busy wanting something, the only thing you develop at the end of the day is the facility to want. If you really are wishing for it and hoping for it, I promise you, you must have incredible Adonis-like muscle in wanting and hoping, none of which are a substitute for action. None of them are a substitute for taking on the responsibility to cause something new. So the inmates had to first take responsibility for the actions and the leadership model that got them where they were. And then we worked with this community of inmates to design a new model for leadership. And the reality was, for the inmates that were in the project, they were in an extremely confined condition. And if they could create a qualitative difference for their community in the jail against the push of society's design to keep them incarcerated, well, if they can pull that stunt off in jail, when they do get released, and the vast majority of inmates are released at some point in time, they now show up with some muscle development in order to make some new impact in their own community business once they leave. And I can tell you that we have a full range of folks who went through the project. And I mean, the very first Narcotics Anonymous group that was started by inmates was started by one of the inmates in our project. the very first one in the history of Narcotics Anonymous. And it was revolutionary. You know, everybody, all of a sudden the question was, why the hell isn't this happening? So many people are in here because of opioid abuse or heroin abuse, you know. Here's a ready population looking for something like that. But wanting that change wasn't enough. You know, it really took the existential act of new leadership, making a declaration that it will no longer be like this anymore, for someone to move the ball. So, waiting for society, trust me, nobody in society wanted any of these guys released. No one was going to make that case. So they had to actually distinguish and make declarations around a possibility that was big enough that the quality of that experience would impact people throughout. And that gets you beyond the trap that our culture says about wishing, wanting, and hoping. Thank you for that.
Hi.
Hello.
So I think you've spoken a lot about language and about timing, but I did want to kind of like circle back to something you said earlier about a routine, and specifically for me, I don't know about anybody else in the room, but as an aspiring business owner, and I still have to maintain, you know, a 9 to 5, I hate. No, I like it, but
just in case anyone's watching, right?
Yeah. But how do you develop routines to really stay focused? Because I found myself that I become so you know, overwhelmed and really taken over by the vision that somebody else is doing at my job, that I'm not able to maintain the focus on myself and what I'm trying to do. So I don't know, in your years of experience with consulting with clients, and what kind of routines and advice you can give me and anyone else in the room that is maybe struggling with that same thing.
So I would say the thing that we tend to take a look at is what's the structure. So as Russ just talked about with the prison inmates, right? He said that they got there as a function of the fulfillment of the leadership of their community, right? Structures fulfill on their design. Structures fulfill on their design. So what have you designed to fulfill your goals? If the structure is I want to write a book, or if the goal is I want to write a book, then the structure could be I'll write 2 pages a day. You got it? And then you just have to empower the structure. In the absence of structure, it's a want, a wish, or a hope.
So a question for an example. Y'all distinguished about how the value of distinguishing something with language to bring about something new. Can you give examples of clients that you've worked with that have started off with something, they were trying to do something and wasn't quite working, and with your help they were able to distinguish, aha, this is the thing, we can communicate in this way, and just maybe give a story about that for some specific examples of those deltas?
I'll give you one that I love.
Amazing.
So we have a client, and she is a nurse consultant. She goes into hospital systems, and specifically at hospitals where they're not meeting their federal guidelines and in danger of losing their funding, right? So she goes and works for ICUs, ECUs, these different, critical care units that she'll go in, get them straightened up, everything's good, they pass whatever their reviews are that they get, and then she moves on. And typically her timeline on those things is about 18 months. So we began working with her, and actually we did what we call our foundation conversations with her, and then she had just gotten a new assignment. And she's also someone who's a black belt in Six Sigma, so she tracks her effectiveness. So over her next assignment, which she actually completed in 6 months, she said that we impacted her effectiveness by 732%. That's not the best part. So in this particular hospital that she was working in, which was in California, in the Kaiser system, I think somebody has Kaiser connection. So the nurses are in a union. And while this unit was fully staffed, she couldn't, they hadn't been able to do anything to impact the nurses changing their schedules. So they had this dispute that had been going on for 5 years. And so the hospital was currently incurring $2.2 million a year in overtime because they couldn't make the nurses change their schedule. Over that time, they had a federal mediator, they brought in a union mediator, they brought in a psychologist, and they had a study done, 5 years. She said, is there something that you guys can do about this? Well, that's it. We literally spent an hour with her, because our coaching calls are an hour. Spent an hour, created a conversation. She went back, had a 1-hour conversation with the nurses. At the end of the conversation, the nurses said, we need to change our schedule. And it was done in less than a week.
Yeah, actually, what's interesting about what Blake's speaking to is the nurses and the way things were happening in that particular hospital, everyone was related to the grind, right? It's already stressful to be in the hospital, let alone to be in the ICU of the hospital, where the most critical patients are, right? So it was a hard lift. It was a difficult environment, difficult place to be in. And for the nurses, you know, listen, they're doing hard work, and it takes an incredibly special person to be willing to, you know, be with someone at such a critical moment in their life. That the inquiry that we created with that consultant as she went back into the hospital was just simply to ask, why are you a nurse? What was it? Why did you do? Why you could have done anything? Why did you choose this? And our client, her name's Gigi, was amazed at the candor that these people had, you know, these nurses had, about wanting to make a difference, about, you know, feeling helpless when someone in their family, when they were young, was ill, and, you know, wanting to be the care, you know, provider, you know, for these people, you know, in their most desperate moment in life, as maybe with many of them coming to the end of their life. So all of a sudden, you know, what wasn't great about administration, what kind of sucked about the schedule, you know, what they didn't like, was no longer the focus of their conversation. Now, as a group, they had reacquainted themselves with the passion that they had. And, you know, I mean, I'm married to a nurse, right? My wife is an incredible person, and I love her, and I fell in love with her because of the kind of heart that she has and who she's willing to be. And these nurses are people who are willing to extend their hearts out to these people in order to try to make a difference and extend themselves to the families of these folks. And once that became the dominant and prevailing narrative in their department, in the ICU, it was a 2-week turnaround that this 5-year issue that was unresolved got resolved, all as a function of the nurses aligning newly around the vision and the value and the opportunity of being a high-quality nurse. It wasn't working. There was no integrity in being in an environment that they were at odds with administration, and it didn't work if they were just stripping this facility of revenue just as an act of, you know, defiance, right? All of a sudden you have a community that's just really focused on, we're going to stick it to the administration, as opposed to a department that's saying, we're here to give uncompromising care, right? That's who we are, and that the circumstances are not who we are. We're going to create the circumstances and the environment that delivers on the promise of giving uncompromising patient care. That's how that happened. Thank you for that question.
It occurs to me just a note on that is often it's not just about getting clear about the structure and where you're going to do it, but then it's then looking at what else is impacting your ability to then do that. Like as an example, if you're looking at your time, you know, a lot of people, like I'm a mom and I run my own business, and I am more of a night person with output. But I was finding that it's not working, like in terms of then my kid's schedule in the morning and what time I have to wake up to that. So I realized that a lot of the people that I noticed were writing a lot and getting a lot done were getting up before the kids in the morning. And just saying, okay, so I'm going to do that and put it in my calendar and do that was completely not effective, because what I needed to do in addition to that was then look at what were the conditions the night before, or how I'm, basically maintaining the rest of my life that would keep me from waking up in the morning and do that. And those were the harder choices to have to make. And also building into that there would be some resistance probably. And then it might take me a while to actually wake up in the morning at 5 or 4:30 and actually feel great.
Sure.
And that went back to, okay, well, what's my declaration and what's my vision for what I want to create? And when those get sewn together, and literally for me, as powerful as I am, my intention for that, it was such a lifelong way of living a certain way. I literally have to have it in front of me. This is a declaration of what I'm doing, what I'm doing. It's about what I desire and not what I'm giving up. But understanding I'm going to have to give up something to get that. That the gains won't even make it look like any more than I'm giving it up, but I'm just not there yet.
Sure. Excellent. Thank you. And actually, what's wonderful about what you're saying is you're speaking to maintaining the existence of that language. People have all different practices, right, in order to keep themselves inspired. I know I created a vision board for myself, right, where I got my kids, my older kids weren't so interested, but my younger guys jumped right in, right? And it's like, let's cut out pictures that will show the house we're going to move into, and let's look at, the things that, the life we're going to have, and how many dogs are we going to have now, and, and what's where are we going to do all of this stuff? And it as an exercise, got the entire family aligned around this vision, right? I mean, my 5-year-old is like the strictest supervisor I've ever worked with. I mean, he is relentless. Daddy, you're on a diet, and you gotta work. Get on the phone. And I'm like, wow. I'm like, this is terrible. He's like, I want the PlayStation 4, and I want it now. And I'm like, well, Daddy's gonna work on that, okay? But he's there like a drill sergeant, But for him, it's because he sees this future opportunity, and he's all excited about the possibility that is. That it's all about keeping his foot on the gas, which is my greatest motivation. Yes.
I'm wondering if you can share with us what are some of your main influences that you draw from and have integrated into your field of thought that you coach from, be that programs, authors, etc. As well as curious, what are some now that are kind of sparking you and growing your own consciousness?
That's a great question. That inspiration can show up any place, right? I mean, a couple of authors, if I'm just spitting out authors' names and stuff, I love the work that Eckhart Tolle did in The Power of Now. I love the book by Alan Watts, The Taboo Against Knowing Who You Are. Let me see, what else? Some philosophers that I actively follow. There's a gentleman, Bob Adamson, out in Melbourne, Australia. He's somebody who speaks in the practice of Aveta as a study. He refers to his teacher as his guru, was a gentleman by the name of Sri Nisargadatta Maharaj. And the book that Maharaj wrote was called I Am That. Excellent book, excellent read. And it links a lot of these, abstractions with some new language that makes it a very powerful play. What about you?
So Russ makes me read a lot of books I don't like. But books I do like, I love The Art of War. I read The Art of War at least once a year.
Sure.
I love Mashimoto's The Book of Five Rings. I mean, so you can can tell I like these battle books. I like these things that look at strategy and analyze strategy and how do we break down strategy and where does the strategy come from, and how do you know when you're screwing it up? It's like that's the whole purpose of the art of war. I love Collins's Good to Great. It's like, so that's the kind of, so he makes you read the philosophy books. I like the business books. I like the military books, but the art of war is what I would say. I can tell you I read that at least once a year. And for me, it's always about looking at what is the strategy. How do we, if you've never read The Art of War is to win without fighting. And then the rest of the book is what to do once you've screwed that up. Right? So you didn't win without fighting, now you gotta fight, now here's the rest of the book. And so it's just a phenomenal book that's 6,000 years old of strategy of what to do now that you have the problem.
We're coming to a close. I think we have room for maybe 2 or 3 more questions. Sure.
Hi, Shoki. I have a small company. It's a startup. It's called Ethical and Efficacious LLC. So it can be both ethical and effective, the other word for efficacious. We're going to launch TV shows that are politically progressive in advertising. We have people like Bernie Sanders on television, broadcast television. And I also do real estate for vegan restaurants, expanding those. I feel like there could be more of a community here in terms of the discussion. I mean, I read a book when I was a grad student called How to Change Colleges, and it was a past president of Sarah Lawrence College, which is a very kind of liberal college up north here. And he had a chapter on abolishing the lecture system. So I'd like to hear more of like a community of scholarship here, or a community here, to hear more about my neighbors are hearing more than I've heard, and from each other. More interaction. That's just my feedback. Thank you.
Really quickly, we did have that as the design, but because the RSVPs went outrageously high, we decided to shift it. But I think we're going to be planning where we really integrate conversation, within the community, and we're able to speak to each other and learn what we are all up to. And I think this building is truly dedicated to knitting us together and making a new conversation so that we can have a transformational breakthrough in consciousness in our city and perhaps affect other cities as well. So grateful for you all being here.
I just want to say something to that too, Paula, is what's great about the nature of building that robust conversation. It kind of speaks to a condition that Alan Watts speaks of when he says that there's always more occurring than what's available to your point of view. So, and everyone has a point of view, and our experience of the world is consistent with our own worldview, and it has blind spots. So when you bring in, multiple perspectives, that overlap starts to happen, and the energy really shifts because you're able to source a lot of other perspectives that as an individual you'd never be able to have access to. So it's really, that's an ideal way to design, inquiries and opportunities like this, and hopefully we'll have those opportunities going forward. So thank you. Sir.
I wanted to extend a quick invitation if anyone's interested in this topic. I've been considering for a few weeks, especially with how technology is advancing and where the implications are that at some point in time we're going to be off the planet. And so I'm thinking about this. That's going to change how we see ourselves in relation to the universe. So instead of just being Earth humans, we're actually then cosmic humans, right? Or galactic humans, or planetary. And so I see in terms of language, this actually may influence how we start talking about each other and our education topics. And with one of my declarations being of self-education, if anyone's interested in actually just exploring that topic, where do we go when we become a planetary human? We then would have to change politics to planetary politics, right? It's not just about us. Planetary economics, planetary resources. So everything that we do now would actually have to scale, and we'd have to expand our way of thinking. So just a fun topic, if anyone's interested in moving towards that. I'm thinking of a manifesto. Maybe we could write something collectively and just start to produce this philosophy of what it looks like to be a cosmic human, because we will no longer be just an earth-based.
What's your name, sir?
Trent.
Trent. Do you see that what Trent's speaking to is that jazz in language that we're talking about earlier? Right? What he's talking about doesn't exist today. You know, it's a future possibility. The language for that doesn't exist either. So this is all about, you know, creating and inventing the language that makes that available and accessible. So it's very much, if you're out to create the conscious planet, you know, it's all a matter of having that kind of exercise with language.
Yeah, gosh, imagine if we carried some of the tendencies that we tend to demonstrate here, we carry those same tendencies to another planet, right? And we'll just be repeating
Sure.
what we do on Earth. So
Sure.
kind of need something.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you know, there's something to the adage that history repeats itself. Yes.
So I work in the space of language, and in a very different context from everything we've spoken about today, which is very external and communicated language. And I'm having trouble finding my distinction with the development of the business I'm building, because it's in the space of essentially self-help and self-improvement, and can be seemingly such an oversaturated market. So the language that I am speaking to is the language of self, language in our mind, the thoughts that we have that shape every experience that we assign value to based on how we speak to it in our mind. And also the language that we understand through reading people's actions and how we're affected by that. Like you were speaking earlier about violence, and violence is essentially a symptom based on something else that's happening. Similarly, anger is not somebody being angry at you, but it's them calling out for help. I think Tony Robbins said people only speak in two languages, either expressing love or expressing a cry for help. So as I'm developing my business and my platform, I guess my question to you is, how do I continue to do so without being bogged down by this sticking point of one, worrying that I'm going into such a saturated market, but really creating the distinction for what I'm doing? How do I, you know what I mean, establishing the distinction for the thing, but not being bogged down by trying to do the distinction, if that makes sense.
Sure.
Yeah. It's great because the thing you're actually looking to do is to distinguish it. So we could say that there is this saturated market for, you know, gyms everywhere. Yet that didn't stop the founder of CrossFit from building a national phenomena, you know, in what seemed like no time, right? And it had to be, listen, his barbells weren't any different, right? They didn't weigh any more or less in his gym than they did any place else.
It's just a process.
Right? He had a system, and he sold value to the system. He created a conversation about what the value was of his system over anything else. It's really that simple. He distinguished that and said, here's what's available, here's what we do, here's the game we play, do you want to play? And people played it and had great stuff to say about it. And then inside of that, he didn't just leave it there, he then built a community around it and fostered the conversation, right? No different than what we're out to do here. Build a community around it and foster the conversation. So if you want to look for what the model is to expand that, you could just look at CrossFit. He built it in an already crowded marketplace, but he created some unique conversation. And he said that what we do is unique, but I mean, listen, you could do that anywhere. He just said, we'd love you to do it here. Right?
Paul, I think
One
you're...
more question?
Okay, great.
But to jump on that answer too is that, you know, I hear you guys use the word game so much. I was struggling with something recently and you were like, you're not in the game of making it. Just get back in the game of making it. And it just immediately became not bogged down, not, not a thing I had to do, but I was in the game of making this. I'm in the game of making this other thing. And each thing, adopting it as a game.
So, a game is when what isn't is more important than what is. And as part of the rules of the game, you want to set a timeline for the game. I'm going to play the game, here's how it goes. When we were kids, we used to play games all the time. I remember running down the street with my cousin, we'd run down, if you step on a crack, you break your mother's back. Oh, I hit a crack. Okay, next game. But now we have all the significance about it.
Yeah, it wasn't so bad. You're like, oh, my poor mother, what I did. Or it's like, here you go, Mom. You could play the game anyway, but without the significance, right? And the opportunity when designing the game is recognizing that there's something that you're willing to value more, which doesn't exist now than how it currently is. So, thank you for that, Paul. And I just want to take a second and really just acknowledge the community here. If we look out in the world, there's no such thing as a performance management consultant, right? There may be a thing called a table or a mic stand, but there isn't a thing called performance management consultant. And we're able to experience what it is to be a performance management consultant out of the generosity of your time and your willingness to be in this conversation and bring rigor to the questions and the language that we have. And I don't take your time lightly. Blake and I are really committed that that this event and future events be ones that are a contribution to you and your effectiveness. I really want to thank you for the privilege that it's been to be here today. This is the first time we've done something like this in an incubator, and it's really cool. So, thank you very much.
Thank you everyone for coming. If you have any questions about this, come talk to me. But also, if you have a desire to see the building, come talk to me. I'll take you on a tour. Fantastic. It's real pretty. Okay.
Oh, do we have another question?
Hello, can you hear me? Hi everyone. I'm typing away because we have 2 brand new members that are signing as we speak. So please forgive me, but we'd love to have you join our community. We have social spaces, open dining, beautiful dining component, and co-working spaces as well. So we're honored to have Paula here as our ambassador and advocate, and all of you, and certainly our distinguished guests. So thank you.
Thank you.